Here we are on the Icarian cycle in reference to the historical figure of Icarus. In the context of that, we will be reading a good portion of The Great Gatsby, one of the most interesting insights into the early 1900s US culture, albeit fictitious, that we have. I think there is a lot to be said for the content of this exact piece of literature. For many of you, you might be familiar with it from your childhoods or maybe even your early adulthood, in that it has been part of some literature curriculum. But if you're anything like me, that was a very long time ago. And in the course of that, we have a lot to, I think, go back to take another look at in the context of what is being presented, aside from just the value of the literature insofar as being something to read. There's also the construction of it, the way it's put together, the design of the thing, if you will, on top of the fact of its drive. Once again, to Zelda. Then wear the gold hat, if that will move her. If you can bounce high, bounce for her too, till she cry, lover, gold-hatted, high bouncing lover, I must have you. Thomas Parkey, D'Invilliers. Chapter 1 done. I think that was properly some of the finest prosaic poetry that I had encountered in a very long time whenever I finally came to re-review this book, and my goodness, it's surprising that this sort of literature, especially with my sort of perceptions about today's schooling, or especially yesteryears whenever I was participating in the literature for education, offered such a phenomenal piece, earnestly, and without any sort of major pretense. I think it really does offer quite the pastiche, quite the vignette, quite the sort of subtle insight into the nuances of precisely what life of this time was like for these particular demographics, and what kind of ideals you might readily hear just being thrown out into the ether of the world. And I must say, outside of just the sort of historic element of it, the descriptive language that's put on display here, I think really does offer a great deal of addition. It paints, and it paints well, I say. Okay, Chapter 3. Overall, it's been an interesting part so far. I think that Chapter 2 certainly has diverted from so much of the flowery purpleness that comes with a little bit of the grandiloquence that I actually really enjoy in the illustration of the scenes from the first chapter. But this one, I think it gives a little peek into the cynicism that, whether it had pre-existed within our protagonist here or not, I think it's definitely growing much more thorough. I think it's definitely something that's becoming internalized, and much per his descriptions of his own character and the origins of it in the beginning, it's putting on display his willingness to simply roll with the punches, to not make judgments, and to carry on. And in that, it gives the characters, the folks around him, and all of their little entourages something of some time to really show who they are. My God, do they show who they are. Much more viscerally, much more earnestly. And I think there is much that can be summarized in the simple aphorism that the words of the drunk are the thoughts of the sober. I believe the profundity of that often goes overlooked. On to Chapter 4. So much insight into the character. It's really something that the colorful, the illustrative, the illuminating language is able to take such a complexity to make it so earnest and sincere. And I think that reflects very thoroughly in all of the writing that we managed to maintain a whole perspective. And the agent word there, I think, is whole, in that even for the things that are not made explicit about the thoughts, the feelings, the ideas, and in such a short time as 3 chapters, that it is able to genuinely give us the insight of one's mind, to infer very much the whole character of our man here. And yet we have such scant details on him, frankly. We know about his history as a veteran, in brief, and a few of his reactions to things. And from these, the deduction that one can make about all of his sensations and feelings, which often lie completely implicit, I think that's the core. I will say, I think ultimately the keenest takeaway from all of this, insofar as what might be drafted from this material, is characterization. And I don't say that lightly. And I think all of us who have ventured into any kind of a narrative, be it written especially, but more broadly any kind of a narrative where there are efforts at making a character seem character-like, we've all had the misfortune of bumping into dry, overly verbose, and frankly vacuous, trite efforts as they they are rendered. I think it's self-evident in the idea that we are able, regardless of how much detail is expressly put into a thing or otherwise, of trying to make a living sort of characterization, a living narrative about anybody. And I think that is eminently applicable more to especially those of us who do have an interest in the tabletop, the cooperative story, whether you're approaching it more from the wargamer side or more from the psychodrama side. I saw them one spring in Cannes. I should probably look that up. Uno momento. And I thank the Frenchman who just taught me how to pronounce that. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes. To your comments then, Egg. Yes, welcome, the Egg of East and West. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I do appreciate that. There is some intimate tension amidst both Daisy and Jordan, no doubt. But things were a goodly sum different back then. I do wonder, if I'm not entirely out of the loop, and there is one that already exists, what a retelling of a story like this, if it could even happen, frankly, would be like in today's substrate, this medium that we exist in now. I think it would take a very different direction. I don't necessarily know if I would prefer it, but it would certainly be a difference in direction, no doubt. Interesting, no matter what, to see the evolution of such things. But about the chapter that we just read, I know that some do attempt to maintain a cinematic description of exactly what they're trying to describe and detail, but I think that quality that was able to be achieved in making a camera of the reader's mind in the accomplishment of going into Jordan's story, especially after following the mistiness of the entire chapter, I dare say that it frames, in direct reference to what I was mentioning about the cinematic, the camera of the mind's eye, it takes the sight of the properly imaginative reader and make something of a scene in their Cartesian sense and convey the exactitude of a moment in time with a narrator's perspective. Where the first chapters before the fourth ultimately were very much about making a vignette, setting the grounds, establishing the characters, and getting the full grip of especially our protagonist here. The thoroughness of the fourth chapter to bring us together in a culmination of what I think is probably best described as simply a scene. I think that is the fulfillment of the fourth chapter in earnest. And on that ending scene, I will say there is very much something to be noted about the excellence of crescendo, albeit, yes, in what is now, I think, something of a cliche. I think this piece here at least goes against, if not precedes, that cliche of the romantic climax and the pulling close and the intimacy that can be anticipated of a moment as that. I think it really does capture a romantic magic. A piece that I have really started to solidify as a genuine reality has come to be that there is the classic formula of the crescendo, climax, and decrescendo. In each one of these, in minute detail, I think that there is discrete rise and fall to each and every one of these chapters and the little stories that exist within them. Having pondered in the process of the reading on what I was saying earlier about the narrative excellence that's on display here and the characterization that goes on with that and how it feels living, alive, breathing, has the essence of verisimilitude, I think, uncontestably. I think that is the core of it, what enables it, what empowers it, and facilitates it, that there is a sort of array of rises and falls that overlap and intertwine. If you were to think of the entire story, or any story for that matter, as a series of threads, in the literal sense, being leveled in a ladder or vertical file, and you were to then monitor those tracks as they go about from left to right, as a graph, you can think of it, a diagram in fact, and you then tracked specifically on the vertical axis the interfaces of these things, and you had a value that you assigned to the various critical points, especially those intersections that gave a sort of peak, a rise or a fall, or somewhere along that classic transition and trade, although it not be necessarily linear. You would find the syntactic heart of this book, and admittedly I think anything anything that has a deep lore to it, as this one, I argue, does, despite the length of its being. In many a way, some of the very best art, and what genuinely might actually be classified as art depending on your evaluation of aesthetics, that falls into the category of something like this. Something that you can talk about indefinitely and still have something new to say. It brings to mind the concept of some superstitious and some spiritualist even today, but especially more popular back during origination of photography, would think that there is a capturing of a spirit in a photograph, or much less a film, a moving picture, art. What we might actually categorically classify as art, not picking out the nuances, the finitudes of all the minute portions. I would argue that is defined by such an extension, which could be spoken about indefinitely. Suffice to say, Chapter 5, just excellent. Continuing that previous trend of having a great many pyramids scattered about, of rises and falls, that is an artful transition away from the focus on characterization that was so present in the earliest of chapters into the cinematic element, as was just, I think, most especially prolific in Chapter 4. And now it's transitioning from that into a characterization of Gatsby, not so dissimilar from Carraway. A move from a catalog into scenes at the end especially. This is spread consistently near the ends, where Fitzgerald wanted to elevate things quite substantially to not make it feel like it's going out with a bit of a whimper. But we are falling back into that poetry, that Cartesian effort of attempting to plant the very construct of the thing in its significance. It gives to your mind the object of the scene in a more theoremic way to put it.